Of course, we can and we should cross those boundaries when we find the convenience to do so in the classroom as well as in our research. And in this respect, history is, by nature, I think, probably the most promiscuous of all disciplines. And I confess to having frequent, intimate, unprotected, but consensual intellectual contact with political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists, and most gratifyingly of all, philosophers.
Basically, as already mentioned, I'm a maritime historian, and therefore, up to a certain degree, kind of by nature of my own historic subdiscipline, inclined to cooperate with the natural sciences. And if we are thinking about the marine area, this kind of normally used interdisciplinary work in history seems to be prone to disciplines like maritime history or some other fields more than to other fields within the discipline. And so I decided to focus a little bit on this field, in particular on the question of interdisciplinarity, or you might also say how to make history useful, how to make it applicable. And I thought the easiest would be to begin with a source, and very typical source for historians. But if you are thinking about this in the context of science class, of an oceanography class, and very few students would have the ability to analyze, to get a critical approach to such source material, to take from the source material a little more than it's just an outdated ship and maybe an interesting expedition of the 1860s. But if you're really thinking about it, as Bob has mentioned, there are different ways to look at it, and there are different ways to take materials from it. That brings me at the same time to the question, is interdisciplinary teaching that easy that we can simply combine history students and students from the sciences into one room and try to develop a common core or common curriculum for those two groups that works for both of them? Unfortunately, I need to admit, in my experience with teaching on both sides of this, you might say, major divide of the academic world, it's not so easy. And it's not because students aren't really prepared, it's basically because we are seeing very different approaches. You might simplify it to the expectation, what are you expecting when you are repeating an experiment? In the natural sciences, you are expecting the same result again and again, unless or otherwise your experiment isn't really valid. Do the same thing in the humanities. Of course, you're looking forward to get different results again and again because of different interpretation. So we have this, you might say, clash of cultures when we are teaching at this divide.
But I want to talk about something that I've done so far that I've found to be exciting and fun, and I think the students are enjoying it also. So I want to start by saying I work in ancient history, and I feel like this is a great time to be working on ancient history. Students are very excited about it, very interested in it on the one hand, but on the other hand, in many ways, I get non-majors who aren't prepared. They're coming in with background from popular culture and things like that that have piqued their interest, and so I have excited students. But on the other hand, dealing with evidence, dealing with sources is a struggle for them. And I approach that in the classroom by bringing in a lot of different types of evidence. I bring in archaeological evidence, I look at architecture, I look at mosaics and frescoes like at Pompeii, I look at papyri, which gives us a glimpse into the daily lives of people. I look at inscriptions, especially funeral inscriptions that show us what people valued at the moment of their death. But when you get to political history, and a lot of people coming into a class on ancient Greece and on ancient Rome, they're interested in this political history, but then they start to their eyes glaze over a little bit, because then it starts to turn into names and dates and foreign terms that they have to remember, and it gets a little bit more complicated, and some of these other types of evidence that I bring in aren't as applicable when I'm talking about political history. And one of the things that I've done so far is I've introduced some role-playing into my classes, and this specifically deals with political history in a way that helps them understand the complicated political climates, especially of Greece and Rome. These aren't scenarios that I've written myself. This is a pedagogy series, the Reacting to the Past series, and I've used two of them. The Threshold of Democracy is set in Athens, right after Athens gets defeated in the Peloponnesian War, and Athens is trying to rebuild itself and figure out how to pick up the pieces and move on. And Beware the Ides of March is set right after the assassination of Julius Caesar. And what do we do in the city now?
You mentioned concepts, defining concepts. That's really, I discovered pretty quickly teaching here that you can't just throw out words like liberalism, democracy, or even slavery and expect people to know exactly what you mean by them. Liberalism is a good example. When I teach the 19th century, I can't talk about liberals and say, well, we don't define them. The 19th century liberalism is not what liberalism today is in American political culture. So I think it's really important when we get to concepts, abstractions. For example, slavery. I mean, most of my students will think slave is somebody who works hard. I mean, it's a piece of property. You have to take the time to define these concepts and then show how they may have been understood differently at different times. Well, I'm thinking of Ernest Brysock's, who's written a lot on historiography and philosophy of history. He said that history is not about the past, it's about time, which is really what you're saying. In other words, it's about the past, the present, and the future, and how the past is in the future, in the present. How we think about the future affects how we think about the past, and so on. They're very, very complexly interconnected. And so, in a sense, you're right. I mean, there's a certain point at which, when we study the past and write about the past, we're really writing about ourselves, right?